Usually when we're talking about records, it's related to someone doing something incredible on the field, but today I wanted to change things up and talk about the records that people aren't necessarily proud to own. Most of these will be for individual players, but I did put some shameful team and organizational records in as well. If you like these types of videos, be sure to press the like button and subscribe because we post videos like this several times a week. The first record I wanted to talk about is most fumbles in a single season, which is shared by two quarterbacks Daunte Culpepper and Kerry Collins. Daunte Culpepper had been the Madden 2002 cover athlete after his 2001 season, and going into the year, people were looking forward to seeing a young quarterback continue to develop. While he did end up passing for a lot more yards than he had the year before, he struggled with turnovers, throwing 23 interceptions alongside a record 23 fumbles. Kerry Collins had led the Giants to the Super Bowl in 2000, and coming into 2001 had quite a bit of hype, but similar to Culpepper, he massively struggled. While he didn't have as many interceptions, the Giants missed the playoffs largely due to close games where those turnovers mattered. The record for most fumbles in an entire career belongs to Brett Favre, with a staggering 166 career fumbles. His worst year came in 2001 when he had 16 fumbles, averaging one per game and solidifying his reputation as a quarterback who was always a risk to turn over the ball. Most of the other players on the all-time fumble lists are quarterbacks, but the first non-quarterback on the list is Tony Dorsett with 90 in his whole career. Moving on to more of a team record, there are two teams that share the record for having the worst possible record in football. The 2008 Detroit Lions were the first to ever go 0-16, while the 1976 Bucks had been winless before. The Lions upped the losses by 2. The only good thing about this for the Lions was that it allowed them to draft Matthew Stafford, who would go on to have several great seasons for the team, alongside megastar Calvin Johnson, who was one of the best receivers of all time. The 2017 Browns also went 0-16, but with their first overall pick, they selected Baker Mayfield, who would take them to the playoffs just to get dumped for everyone's least favorite massage enjoyer. The biggest blowout in NFL history wasn't some random preseason game nobody cared about. Instead, it actually took place in an NFL championship game. In the 1940 season, the playoffs culminated with the Washington Redskins and Chicago Bears playing in the championship. The Redskins had actually beat the Chicago Bears earlier in the year and had a better overall record going into the game. They were playing at home at Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C., and nearly 40,000 fans had gathered to watch what they thought would be a close affair. The Bears, however, had other plans, and a stunned crowd of 40,000 had to sit and watch what would be the biggest blowout in NFL history. The Bears scored on the second play of the game, and their defense completely shut down the Redskins. By halftime, the Bears held a commanding 28-0 lead, and the Redskins didn't fare any better in the second half. The Bears went on to score more while shutting out the Redskins entirely, and the final score was 73-0. The stadium was almost silent as the Bears rushed to celebrate not only winning the NFL championship, but also setting the blowout record that stands to this very day. For 80 years, this game has remained the single biggest point differential in NFL history. For this next record, we have to understand that having your own quarterback sacked is a bad thing. I want to make that clear because clearly these next teams did not get the memo to keep their quarterbacks safe. In 1986, the Philadelphia Eagles set the all-time record for most sacks allowed in a single season with 104. They had started the season with veteran Ron Jaworski, but he was not surprisingly injured from the beating he was undertaking trying to lead the team with the worst offensive line in history. Thankfully, they had Randall Cunningham to take the lead because he was going to need all those scrambling skills to even have a chance to stay alive in the backfield. Through the season, they struggled massively. They went 5-10 with one tie, mainly because it was impossible for the offense to do anything when they were constantly losing yards on a sack. In every single game of the season, they had at least 3 sacks. They gave up over 700 yards through the entire year through sacks. While that would be a solid season for a wide receiver by itself, it isn't so great to be losing those yards in must-win games. The only positive from this season was that it really allowed Randall Cunningham to showcase how his scrambling amazing ability to make plays possible. Without that, there is a good chance the team would have been another to get a dreaded 0-16 record. This next honor belongs to an entire organization, and that is the honor of most players that have been arrested. There are 3 teams that stand far above the rest. In third place is the Bengals, which have had 54 players arrested since the year 2000. In second is Denver Broncos with 56 arrests, and the Vikings are number 1 with 60. Some of the most notable arrests are Dennis Johnson being arrested for powder possession in 1983, Randy Moss's arrest in 2002 for reckless driving, and multiple players arrested in the infamous Love Boat incident in 2005. Obviously, no team wants this honor, but I would have thought it would belong to the Chiefs considering how many arrests they seem to have each offseason. The next one is a record that actually belongs to Hall of Fame quarterback George Blanda. In 1962, he was playing for the Houston Oilers, and while he passed for 2,800 yards and 27 touchdowns, none of that made up for the fact that he had thrown an NFL record 42 interceptions in one season. During this season, he actually had 2 separate games with 6 interceptions, but somehow managed to hang on to his starting role through the season. His best game of the entire season came from a win over the New York Titans, where he had 3 touchdowns paired with 3 interceptions. While he did go on to have a Hall of Fame career, there's no denying that this season was the definition of an absolute train wreck. The 1979 Chiefs were a fine team when looking at them from a bird's eye view. They went 7-9 while missing the playoffs, but that sounds like a pretty mid overall record. When you start to dive into the numbers, however, it's clear that their offense was a total mess. They cycled through several quarterbacks and none of them were able to provide anything in the way of performance. Their entire season was a disaster in the passing game, with the team only totaling 1,600 passing yards combined. The Chiefs were in a rough spot as a franchise during this era, and their mediocrity was not going to be replaced for several years. While the team had drafted Steve Fuller that year to potentially fill the hole, he was not good enough to fix anything wrong with the franchise. The Bills hold a record most NFL fans are familiar with, and it's also one I don't think will ever be broken within our lifetimes. They were an absolute powerhouse through the early 90s, every year being at the top of the list for potential favorites for a championship. With Jim Kelly leading a high-powered offense and an elite defense, they won 4 straight AFC championship games, which is a great record, but they proceeded to lose every single Super Bowl appearance they ever had after. For 4 straight years, they ended up runner-ups and were never able to cross the threshold. Their first Super Bowl loss was a heartbreaking 20-19 loss to the New York Giants, where Jim Kelly would lead a potential game-winning drive that put the game in the hands of Bills kicker Scott Norwood. Norwood had been a solid kicker all year, and many thought he would be able to easily close out the game with a last-second field goal. Famously, the kick sailed wide right, and the Giants watched the time fade out as they became champions of the NFL. This was crushing for the Bills, but in the 1991 Super Bowl, they would lose by 7 points to the Redskins. Going into 1992, no one thought they could go to a 3rd straight Super Bowl, but they beat the odds. While they made it back to the Super Bowl, they were absolutely obliterated by the Cowboys, who beat them handily with a final score of 52-17. In 1993, they returned back to the Super Bowl once again, but they had a rematch with the Cowboys, who handily beat them again. After that, they failed to return to the Super Bowl again, and the potential dynasty had to return to Buffalo completely empty-handed. No one has ever even been to 4 straight Super Bowls since, which shows that they weren't just some overrated team fluking their way there. They just were choke artists of the highest level. Sticking with the Bills, they also own one more record that is pretty embarrassing. They are the only NFL team that has ever lost a matchup to a CFL team. In August of 1961, the Bills played the Hamilton Tiger Cats, which are located just across the border in Canada. Usually when NFL and CFL teams meet, the American League beat the brakes off their northern competition, but on this day, the Bills would manage to be bested 38-21. That game has remained the only loss the NFL has ever taken at the hands of the CFL. However, in the modern era, those exhibition games aren't played anymore, meaning the Bills likely get to hang on to this record for all of eternity. Speaking of great teams that couldn't get across the finish line, the Bills at least managed to get to the Super Bowl and lose. The 2010 Chargers looked absolutely elite on paper. They had Phillip Rivers in his prime, with Darren Sproles and a rookie Ryan Matthews making up the backfield, with Eric Weddle making impact on the defensive side of the ball. Through the season, they managed to have the #1 ranked offense and defense when it came to yards gained and yards allowed. In theory, having the #1 offense and defense should have led to at least a 12-4 record. record. After all, if you can score more than anyone alongside stopping them from scoring, that sounds like a recipe for wins. However, somehow the Chargers got the #1 ranked offense and defense just to miss the playoffs entirely. They had lost 5 of their first 7 games due to whiffed plays by the special teams unit, causing them to lose by a single field goal. They did go on a great run down the stretch, winning 7 of their last 9 games, but it wasn't enough to clinch the division as the Chiefs went 10-6, which gave them control of the AFC West. The wildcard spots that year went to the Ravens and Packers, who both had a better overall record despite weaker offenses and defenses. The Chargers were the first team since the 1996 Packers to missed the playoffs despite having the #1 offense and defense in the league that same year. The AFC West has been home to a lot of struggles over the years, and another crazy one belongs to the 2014 Chiefs. We know they have one of the worst passing seasons on record already, but this year was somehow almost as bad. While they did manage to get more yards out of their quarterbacks, over the entirety of a 16-game season, they had a total of 0 touchdowns thrown to wide receivers. All of their passing touchdowns came either from Alex Smith throwing to tight ends like Travis Kelce, or running backs out of the backfield like Jamal Charles. What is most surprising about this is that their receiver room wasn't amazing, but it wasn't like they were totally devoid of talent. The Chiefs had Dwayne Bowe still on the roster, and the season before he had 5 touchdowns on the year. In 2014, he did manage to have 750 yards, but couldn't get into the end zone. Alex Smith threw 15 touchdown passes over the course of the whole season, with all of them going to Travis, Jamal Charles, Anthony Fasano, and Niles Davis. The one benefit of this season is that it really kicked the Chiefs organization into high gear when it came to their rebuild, and it was the last season in the last 10 years where they haven't at least made the playoffs. They're in the middle of a dynasty now, and this was the year that really kicked that off. Next up, I wanted to talk about the teams that have the worst records in conference championship games. Nothing is worse than getting 1 game away from the Super Bowl and losing. You get a bad draft pick, and you don't even get the glory of saying you played on the biggest stage in football. Currently in the NFC, the 49ers hold the record for most losses in a conference championship game with 11. While they do have a total of Super Bowls overall, they are a shocking 8-11 in conference championship games. Most recently, they actually went to 3 straight conference championship games and only managed to win 1. In the AFC, the honor of most conference losses goes to the Steelers, who have 8 losses and 8 wins. I will say at least the 49ers have been playing in conference championship games lately. The Steelers seem really content with being knocked out in the first or second round of the playoffs for almost a decade now. 2016 was their last conference championship appearance, where they were beaten by the Patriots on their way to have one of the greatest comebacks in Super Bowl history against the Falcons. Next up is Brandon Browner, who had spent 4 seasons in the CFL before making the jump to the NFL as a cornerback. Brandon was fine on coverage, but he had one glaring issue, and that was constant penalties. Over the course of his 5 seasons, he was constantly in the top 5 for most penalized player every season. His career had a staggering 69 penalties, resulting in a loss of 600 yards. While most years he was 2nd or 3rd in terms of overall penalties, the biggest reason his career came to a close was what happened in 2015. In 2015, Brandon had made his way to the New Orleans Saints, where he had become a starting corner. The issue was that over the course of that season, he broke the NFL record for most penalties in a single season. He had a total of 25 penalties that year, averaging well over 1 per game. Considering he played cornerback, these were usually extremely costly pass interference calls that cost the Saints several games. He was such a liability that after the season ended, he was not asked to return by the time, and instead he wound up back on the Seahawks, where he was cut after the 3rd preseason game due to him not being able to rein in his penalty issues. As for what team has the most penalties in their entire history, that honor belongs to the Chicago Bears, who have a total of 7,700 penalties, and the Rams are pretty close behind with 7,500 total penalties. Given both of these teams have played over 1,200 games, that averages out to about 7 per game, which is above the NFL average of 6 per game. Not by much, but still a bit higher over the course of their history. The team with the least penalties currently is the Texans, but they are also the youngest franchise, so it's a bit misleading to say they get penalized the least. They are averaging about 6.5 per game, respectively. Now I want to shift our focus to coaches. We all know a bad coach can do a number on a team, but there is one man who stands above the rest with by far the worst head coaching record in football history. Hugh Jackson took over the Cleveland Browns in 2016. He had had decent success with other teams, but we all know the Browns are a meat grinder. He finished his first season 1-15, and his second year we all remember as being the infamous 0-16 season. In his third year, he had a new quarterback, Myles Garrett, and people thought things were looking up. However, Hugh Jackson would go 2-5-1 before he was fired by the organization. His final record as the head coach of the Browns was 3-36 with 1 tie. His total career record is 11 wins, 44 losses, and 1 tie. That is a win rate of just 19%, well below anything you would need to make the playoffs. The Browns actually are home to a large portion of the list of worst coaches of all time. Something about that franchise is actually cursed to make sure they never get stable leadership and turn themselves around. The Ravens have some Super Bowls, and the Browns have a lot of head coaches. Sticking with the Browns, I also wanted to talk about which team has had the most starting quarterbacks through the last 2.5 decades. Since the year 2000, the Browns have had a shocking 40 different starting quarterbacks. Granted, some of these players only started 1 or 2 games, but they usually switch quarterbacks at least once in a season. This isn't for lack of trying either. They've drafted 10 quarterbacks over that same period, with 4 of those quarterbacks coming from first-round picks. Something about the Cleveland air apparently makes you forget everything you have ever known about throwing a football. In the 1984 NFL season, the Los Angeles Rams and New York Giants were facing off. The Giants were actually favored coming into the matchup with a better record. However, they would have themselves one of the most error-filled days in NFL history. We all know a safety is supposed to be a rare event where someone is sacked or runs out of their own end zone. Well, apparently the Rams had wanted to score a touchdown worth of points from them because they managed to cause 3 safeties in a single game against the Giants. They blocked 2 punts out of the end zone and also had a sack in the end zone to make up their 3 safeties. While there have been several games with 2, this stands as the only game in which this ever occurred. Speaking of dumb mistakes, there is only one NFL team that can ever say that their own mascot ruined a play for them. The Carolina Panthers were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1996, just the second year of their franchise's existence. The Panthers had punted a ball, and as it hit the field, the mascot known as Sir Purr decided to leap onto the ball despite it being a live ball in play. The refs threw a flag, but didn't really know what penalty to call. After all, in the rule book, there isn't a set rule for mascots deciding to actively participate in the game. The Steelers were given a touchback on the play as the standard had never been set before, but many proceeded to rightfully make fun of the NFL mascot for not knowing the basic rules of football. The Detroit Lions have had a rough go at the last century until the last 2 years. They wasted several years with a prime Matthew Stafford and Calvin Johnson, wasted Barry Sanders, and just were a joke for a majority of my life watching football. Due to their disorganization, they have the second longest drought without a championship that has been going since 1957, with only the Cardinals having a longer drought that started in 1947. However, they do have the dishonor of having been home to the worst GM in the history of the league for 8 years from 2001 to 2008. Matt Millen had a career as an NFL player and in 2001 was hired by the Lions as president and CEO. Over his career, the Lions went a total of 31-84 and even had the first 0-16 season under his tenure. I will give him credit for drafting Calvin Johnson, but that was really the best thing he did as GM. Him and the next GM refusing to build any protection for Johnson or pay him what he deserved played a large part in him deciding to walk away from the game early and giving us one of the biggest what-if questions in football. Now I wanted to talk about a franchise that has rebuilt and then blown itself up at least 5 times in the last 2 decades. The Miami Dolphins were the original worst team in the NFL with a 1-15 season in 2007. While they did at least manage to win 1 game, even with their attempts to field a solid team, they have the longest active playoff win drought in the NFL. It has been 24 years since the Dolphins have managed to win a playoff game, which is shocking considering they've been to the playoffs quite a few times over that stretch. You'd think they'd have been able to get lucky at least once. For 5 straight years from 1997 to 2001, they made the playoffs just to be beaten in their first or second game, then lost 4 wildcard rounds in the last 20 years, even when they seemed to be getting better under different quarterbacks. With the Wildcat offense, or when their defense is in shape, they just aren't good enough to beat playoff quality teams. They are good enough to beat most teams they are supposed to beat, but really appear to fall apart in the playoffs. Their current playoff loss streak is 6 games, and I don't really see a path for them to suddenly become contenders considering their current roster is starting to show its wear and their franchise quarterback can't seem to play an entire season while staying healthy. The other teams in contention for this are the Raiders, who haven't won a playoff game in 22 years, the Commanders, who haven't won in 19, and the Jets, who haven't even managed to make the playoffs in 14 years. The Jets thought that they'd have something with Aaron Rodgers, and I feel like the Commanders with Jaden Daniels will eventually be off this list in the immediate future. Those are just some NFL records that I don't think anyone necessarily wants to own. No one wants to be the team with the most fumbles or the longest playoff win drought streak. Some of these seem pretty unbreakable now, like I can't foresee someone getting 4 safeties in a game with the current rules and coaching. Those players would have been benched before halftime and they'd be flying in a free agent on a private jet to take his place at the half. Obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration, but if a quarterback was on pace for 45 interceptions in a season, there is no way they'd be able to hang on to their starting job through the whole schedule.